Ever wonder why Christians eat bacon but still follow the Ten Commandments? Without a system, it looks like they just cherry-pick which ancient rules to obey. That's why theologians use the threefold division of the law. Take 3 specific commands: do not murder, do not eat pork, and execute rebellious sons. The first rule reflects God's unchanging nature. These eternal commands are called moral laws, and they remain permanently binding for all people across all time. The pork ban was a purity rule designed to point to the Messiah. These are ceremonial laws, and they were completely fulfilled by Christ. But executing a rebellious son presents a sorting problem. It addresses moral behavior, but the extreme punishment feels culturally bound. It goes into a third bucket: rules applying moral principles specifically to ancient Israel's theocracy. These are civil laws, which provide wisdom today but are no longer legally binding. This framework transforms a confusing ancient code into a structured system, separating permanent ethics from temporary context. So what about those 3 rules from the beginning? Murder remains forbidden, bacon is allowed, and ancient penalties expire.
Let's just dive right into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tackling what is, honestly, probably the single most misunderstood book in the entire Bible. Yeah, we're talking about Leviticus. Now, if you've ever tried to read through this ancient text, you probably felt like you stumbled into this incredibly dense, highly complex, and frankly, intimidating instruction manual. But we are going to break it all down today. Think of it like looking at a simple, cartoon-style blueprint, so you can finally see the brilliant architecture underneath the whole thing.
First off, we've got to address the elephant in the room. Why do we always stop reading here? I mean, it's almost a shared cultural joke, right? Ambitious, cover-to-cover Bible read-throughs usually start off super strong in Genesis and Exodus, but then they just die a sudden, painful death the exact moment they hit the rules and rituals of Leviticus. Your head starts spinning with all the endless talk about sacrifices, priests, and ancient purity laws. I get it.
But we need to make a really crucial pivot today. See, there's this pervasive myth that Leviticus is just this dry, ancient butcher's guide to animal slaughter, but the reality? It is actually a profound, totally dynamic blueprint for community, love, and social justice. It's not some bizarre relic of the past. The text actually shows us how a finite group of people can relate to an infinite God.
And because of that, we literally cannot just skip it. Leviticus sits exactly in the structural and theological dead center of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. It's the centerpiece. You've got Genesis and Exodus on one side, and Numbers and Deuteronomy flanking the other. Its very placement means it doesn't just ask for our attention, it absolutely demands it.
Actually, what's really fascinating is the Hebrew name for the book itself. It's called Vayikra, which translates to, "and he called." It paints this beautiful picture of God calling out to Moses from the tent of meeting, essentially inviting humanity closer. So rather than being a book about pushing people away with all these strict rules, it's fundamentally an invitation.
So, who exactly is this invitation for? Well, historically, it's been nicknamed the Book of the Priests. But look at Leviticus chapter 1, verse 2. It says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them." Do you catch that? The instructions here are completely democratized. They're addressed to the entire nation of Israel, not just some elite, secretive clergy class. Literally everyone was expected to understand how this system worked.
To keep things simple, let's map out the architecture of the entire book. Picture a 3-part spatial journey, almost like a simple cartoon map. Step 1 happens deep inside the sanctuary, focusing entirely on sacrifice. Step 2 is right at the boundary, dealing with purity, like who can go in and out. And step 3 ripples outward into the everyday world, dealing with holiness and actual society. Let's walk through this map together.
Part 1. Sacrifices, drawing near to the divine.
Okay, let's just strip away all the heavy theological jargon we normally associate with the English word sacrifice. The Hebrew word used here is korban, which comes from the root krb, meaning literally to draw near. So sacrifice in this context wasn't about punishment or loss or, giving up something you love. It was specifically designed as a physical mechanism to allow mortals to draw near to an infinite God.
And we really need to clear up another massive misconception here. Leviticus actually outlines a silent service. Think about the pagan religions of the ancient world, where worshippers genuinely believed they had to feed, bribe, or somehow appease a really hostile, angry, hungry God. The God of Israel needed absolutely none of that. These rituals were actually a favor granted to the people. It gave them a physical, peaceful way to express their emotions and restore their relationship with the divine.
The framework for all these offerings is actually surprisingly simple. You had voluntary offerings, which were choices you made just to express thanks or seek communion. Then you had mandatory offerings. These were strictly required if you committed a moral infraction and needed to restore that relationship. But across the board, there was one non-negotiable rule. The offering had to be of the absolute finest quality, completely without blemish. Basically, you bring your absolute best when you draw near.
Part 2. Purity, the sacred boundary.
Now, here is a vital distinction that modern readers constantly, and I mean constantly, confuse: ritual impurity versus moral impurity. Honestly, if you don't grasp the difference between these two concepts, Leviticus is never going to make any sense to you. Let's look at them side by side.
First up is ritual impurity, known as tuma. The absolute most important thing to know here is that ritual impurity is not a sin. Not at all. It is simply a natural part of human biology and mortality. We're talking about things like childbirth, menstruation, or skin diseases. It's just a temporary state, it's contagious by physical touch, and all it really does is temporarily restrict your access to the sanctuary. You wash, you wait a little bit of time, and that's it. No guilt involved whatsoever.
Contrast that immediately with moral impurity. Now, this is caused by transgressive, sinful deeds, things like murder or idolatry. It is not physically contagious, and you absolutely cannot just wash it away with some water. Moral impurity is incredibly serious. The text warns us that it literally pollutes the inner sanctuary and defiles the land itself. In fact, if left uncorrected without genuine repentance, the text says it causes the land to literally vomit out its inhabitants. Pretty graphic, right?
Part 3. The Holiness Code, taking the holy into the world.
Okay, prepare to be completely surprised. You have absolutely heard this quote before. Love your neighbor as yourself. It is arguably the most famous ethical command in all of human history. But did you know it originates right here? Right smack in the middle of Leviticus chapter 19? Amidst all of those ancient rituals, we suddenly find this blindingly clear call to everyday morality.
But Leviticus actually takes it even further. Just a few verses later, it commands, "You shall love the stranger as yourself, for you were strangers in Egypt." It explicitly demands love and empathy for the immigrant and the outsider. So it turns out all this highly structured, rigid priestly ritual, it's actually meant to be the choreography of love. It's literally all training for how to treat other people.
This holiness code acts as a highly practical blueprint for justice. It mandates fair relations between employers and employees. It strictly outlaws taking vengeance or holding on to grudges. It creates an entire system for massive debt relief and the return of ancestral lands. It even goes as far as mandating an ecological rest for the earth every 7 years. It's this beautiful, comprehensive infrastructure entirely designed to humanize the vulnerable. In fact, the social justice elements found in Leviticus 25 are so profound that they served as the direct inspiration for Jubilee 2000. That was the massive modern-day international debt relief program aimed at canceling the debts of developing nations. Think about that. These ancient, dusty rules written on a scroll still have the power to actively shape modern global economics today. Leviticus today, an ecological and ethical legacy.
As our sources point out, Leviticus actually provides the core for a surprisingly modern ecological ethic. It basically operates on this deep awareness that human action, even if it is completely unintentional, has real, tangible consequences. It warns us that we can pollute our sacred spaces, and if we defile the land with our actions, the land will eventually become uninhabitable and it will evict us.
Which leads us to this final, pretty provocative thought. Leviticus isn't just some ancient butcher's guide. It is an urgent warning and a beautiful invitation. It asks us to take a hard look at our actions, our relationships, and our environment. So I leave you with this question. Will we learn to treat our world and each other as sacred space? Or will our actions eventually cause the land to evict us too? Think about that as you reconsider this incredibly misunderstood centerpiece of ancient wisdom.
Imagine an ancient desert camp at dusk. Thousands of ordinary tents stretch out into the horizon, housing a massive population of travelers. But dead center in this sprawling encampment sits a single structure, pulsing with an intense, star-like golden light. This presence inhabits the very middle of the community, bringing a specific physical challenge. Pure, radiating holiness and flawed human beings occupy the same square footage, and that proximity creates a constant, high-stakes tension. The text of Leviticus functions as a set of technical specifications. It outlines the clearance levels, protective barriers, and specific decontamination procedures required to exist near this source of energy. Each chapter acts as a guide through the camp's various zones, marking exactly how an imperfect person can step toward the center without being consumed by the intensity of the presence. The first zone of interaction is the courtyard. This is the location of the altar, a site defined by the Hebrew root perp, meaning to draw near. It is a space designed for reconciliation. The sacrificial system follows two tracks. Voluntary offerings allow individuals to bring physical portions of their life to express gratitude, but the mandatory path addresses failures to keep the law. The individual must transfer the weight of their failure to a substitute animal. This system functioned as a divinely provided means of grace. It ensured that humans could physically reset their standing and maintain their place in the camp through a clear, repeatable process. Moving from the common courtyard toward the holy tent required specialized mediators. Aaron and his sons served as the authorized guides through this system, wearing intricate, gem-studded garments that signaled their unique clearance. The priests managed the threshold. They represented the people's needs to the divine, while carefully handling the sanctuary's ritual requirements to prevent any unauthorized contact with the presence. Their role provided the necessary buffer, allowing the community to interact with the holy energy without suffering the consequences of a breach in protocol. The maintenance of holiness wasn't limited to the priests. It extended into the daily, mundane lives of every Israelite living in the wider camp. The camp was divided into concentric zones based on ritual purity. Impurity is a temporary state linked to the vulnerabilities of the human body, like disease or contact with death. These states aren't sins, but move a person to the outer boundary. Dietary laws reinforced this at every meal. By filtering out predators and scavengers, they kept the biology of death outside the inner camp. Returning to a clean state usually required a simple routine, washing with water and waiting for the day to end. This physical reset allowed the individual to move back toward the center of the community. These laws turned the act of eating and washing into a continuous physical reminder that every aspect of their biology existed in relation to a holy God. Individual sacrifices addressed daily mistakes, but they couldn't solve a deeper problem. Intentional, deliberate sins created a spiritual pollution that accumulated in the sanctuary over time, threatening to drive the divine presence out of the camp. Once a year, on Yom Kippur, the high priest performed a high-stakes purge. He was allowed to bypass the final veil and enter the Holy of Holies to sprinkle sacrificial blood, physically scrubbing the sanctuary of a year's worth of accumulated defilement. Outside, the priest laid hands on a second goat, symbolically transferring the nation's intentional rebellions onto the animal. This goat was then led into the uninhabited wilderness, physically carrying the community's sins away from the living presence of God. This annual reset prevented the camp from becoming too toxic for the presence to remain. It ensured the divine could continue to dwell in their midst. The successful maintenance of these boundaries and purges created a specific result, a secure space where the entire nation could transition from the work of survival to the act of celebration. The calendar is filled with mandated feasts like Passover and Tabernacles. Because the protocols kept the camp clean and the relationship intact, the people were free to stop working and spend entire weeks eating together in God's presence. Leviticus provides the technical blueprint that made this shared life possible. It allowed a holy presence to occupy the same space as a flawed people, turning a potentially hazardous proximity into a permanent, protected home.